Ya, sin más preámbulos, sin más protocolos, ahora sí, tenemos con nosotros, dejo orgullosamente a nuestro invitado especial, el Dr. George Siemens. Finally.
Thank you. I'll make a commitment. If I come back to Puerto Rico, I will make sure I learn Spanish before I come back again, because there's about 15 minutes of my life that I won't be able to recall. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for the organizing committee and the individuals that arranged for me to come down. It's been a wonderful experience, very hospitable, and so a special thank you to those that made it possible for me to be here. I want to talk about a series of concepts today, basically 7 key concepts that relate to openness and learning analytics. I'll start off somewhat, I think most of you will be able to relate to some of the concepts earlier in the presentation, but as I move along the presentation, I'll get a little bit at what I think education will develop into in the fairly near future. And by that I'm talking within 5 years or so, where we'll at least start to see the framework of this structure in place. And I should emphasize that, as a starting point, I'll share my perspective of learning and knowledge initially, and then use that as a base for saying why I think that'll start to be fleshed out, or why that will continue to be an ongoing development. So for starters, knowledge is fundamentally a networked concept. When we understand a subject, it's really a network. It's a network of concepts or a network of ideas. And it's not just knowledge, but also the technology that we base knowledge on is networked in nature. If you look, for example, at a laptop in front of you, or an iPhone in your pocket, or whatever you have for mobile devices, those devices have a legacy of ideas, a legacy of inventions, in some cases a legacy of patents. So the ability to create a phone or to create a laptop essentially requires bringing together many different innovations and research ideas over a long period of time. Even if you look at the first steam engine that was created, it was a concept that had a legacy of ideas that lasted over several thousand years, right down to the initial discovery of steam as a means of creating energy. And it's no different when we start looking at knowledge that we personally possess. It has a similar attribute where it's really just a network of concepts and ideas that we've brought in relation to each other. When we add a new idea to that network, we have a new state of knowledge. So that's my perspective on knowledge, and learning then is fairly basic in terms of how it's derived from that, which is that learning is the process of growing or pruning networks. Those networks can be social, those networks can be conceptual in terms of ideas as well. Now let's look a little bit at my view, at least, that traditional knowledge institutions, such as universities, are largely inadequate for the task of dealing with knowledge in a manner that we face it today, in our society today. There's a variety of reasons for this. First of all, obviously, we've had a rapid increase, a rapid iteration and invention of new technologies. It doesn't take long. I mean, you just reflect back 5 or 10 years ago and you look at how many technologies you're using on a daily basis today that you didn't have access to literally 5 or 10 years ago. It's an astonishing array and incredible development. It also influences the fact that our society today is much more integrated than it's ever been. Now that's driven to a degree by the internet and by the web, but it's also being driven by global transportation and global travel as well. So there's a variety of factors that come into play, integration of economies as a whole, but basically we have a society today that is complex, it's integrated, and you can't see really one element without considering it in its entirety. Edgar Morin has a good paper about this, looking at 7 complex lessons for the future, where he looks at the ways in which the knowledge needs of our society today are not being met by the siloed structure of educational systems. Perhaps one of the key concepts, though, and one that all of us feel, I think, probably on a daily basis, is this notion of more is different. A concept that P.W. Anderson first addressed in the 70s, and namely by a paper of that title. And the assertion is, if you increase the quantity of a of an item, you also increase the quality of the item. There is a change in nature. A quote that David Gerlenter has on this topic is, you know, if you have 3 dogs, give them a name. If you have 10,000 head of cattle, don't bother. So there's a sense in which if we have 3 things, we have a different relationship with them than if we have, you know, 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 things. So in the same sense, if you have a limited piece of information, you can interact with it a certain way. You can perhaps memorize it. Perhaps you can take it and organize it into a nice hierarchy, apply a classification scheme to it, and then communicate that to others. But if you have an astonishing amount of information, that technique isn't going to be as effective anymore. You need to learn to relate to information flow in a different way when it has a different nature of abundance. And that gets to a key question, which is, you know, if we were to design a university today, let's say we didn't have a legacy of a university and someone came up to us and said, we would like you to create a knowledge structure that is capable of handling the way in which knowledge is created in society today. And we want that not only to be a space for research, but also for a space of communicating and leading others to further states of knowledge. Would we create the physical structure or the particular mechanisms that we have today, classrooms and those kinds of settings? And I would argue no, we would create a very different institution than what we have, because our teaching dimensions of universities, at least, are intended to communicate what is known rather than to encourage learners in growing and developing their own knowledge. Now, that's a vast simplification, but I think essentially, at least the teaching component of university is exactly that. The research compartment, or the dimension, is a little bit different, but that's not always as tightly integrated into teaching and learning as it ought to be. So we have a period now where we have what I would say a knowledge institution that doesn't quite match the needs of society, doesn't quite match the needs of learners, and it doesn't quite match the needs, or at least the shape and manner in which knowledge is created and generated. But periods of change require a different mode or a different method of response than a stable period. If you have a time frame, for example, where everything is more or less settled, it's fairly coherent, you interact differently within that system than if the whole system is in array, when everything is sort of up for grabs and everything is changing continually. And with the model that we derive our universities from is prefaced on a certain degree of stability around information, a certain degree of stability and knowledge. So we have to let go of that desire for stability, and we have to learn to appreciate, to some degree at least, chaos and complexity. The fact that everything is related, everything is in a constant state of change. You take one element and pull it out and add something new, and you essentially change the network structure. And it's important because ideas need to collide with each other. In order for ideas to develop and to move forward, we need a structure of diversity where we have a lot of different viewpoints and perspectives, some which will be pulled to the wayside and ignored, others which simply need to have the room to grow and to flourish. We don't want a system to kill innovation. We want innovation to change the system. Let's consider an example, something I'd look at as, more or less a modern knowledge need. That, or an example of what this looks like in action. So in late February 2003, coming out of China, was a particular illness that scientists hadn't encountered before. And through a model, because of the way in which it was spread, because of global air travel, in order to address this particular challenge, they put together a global research network where research labs in different countries and different regions essentially were very transparent in sharing their activities around this particular disease with each other. It was an example of a complex problem that no one person or no one research lab was able to quickly find an answer to, and it was one that required a very rapid knowledge growth on the part of the institutions that were involved in determining what this was. Now, in a period from the end of February till April 16th, in that time frame, almost a dozen research labs, leading research labs, virology labs around the world, banded together, shared information, communicated through technology, interacted with each other. One lab goes to sleep, passes data off to the next lab, and research continues around the clock. So within a very short period of time, they managed to define that this particular image that you have on your screen is what's called a coronavirus, which was the cause of SARS. And what I find fascinating about this is What about a traditional education would have prepared someone to participate in this kind of a system of sense-making? You know, what about a university structure of classrooms and lectures that we have today would have helped an individual to be able to participate in real-time, global, networked, collaborative sense-making? Now, certainly, it's well argued that the core skills that the researchers were using were taught in a university system. I won't deny that at all. But definitely the system that enabled them to address a problem quickly is one that most universities don't prepare individuals for. So the first concept is that innovation requires openness. If you want to solve complex problems, if you want to interact with or address concerns that are larger than an individual, issues such as poverty or global warming or a particularly new virus or disease that we encounter, it's not going to be solvable in a research lab by one individual. It essentially needs to be solved in a networked manner in a complex methodology. But the question, I guess, if that's true, and if you agree that innovation, addressing complex problems with innovative solutions, that requires openness, I guess the logical question is, what's openness? What does it mean to be open? Is it a product? Is openness a product like MIT's OpenCourseWare, or a tool like Wikipedia, or a platform like Android? Or is it a publication byproduct, such as the directory listing of open access journals? I mean, is that what we're talking about when we mean openness? Or is openness more of a process? It's not a particular entity that we can look at and say, oh, that's an open course. Does being open in the sense that the discovery of the coronavirus was open, is that a process of sharing and engaging with each other? Or something, for example, like open scholarship, where we begin to share data around research activities and where we begin to share our publications in an open manner well before the current model allows it to be shared. Because, depending on the field that you're in, it can take anywhere from really a minimum of about 1 year to 2, 3, or even more years for an article to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. That means that if in 2003 I would have decided to start looking at blogs, for example, my paper may not have been published until 2004 or 5 or 6, which, as you're likely aware, is a lifetime when you're talking about emerging technologies. Or is it about open teaching and learning? If it's scholarship and open sharing of research, there's illustrations of courses, at least ones I've been involved in, where we've had anywhere from 750 students to over 2,300 students that have taken courses that are free, available online without fee to students who are inclined to participate. So I think under this banner of openness, it's important to emphasize that openness creates more of itself. If you start opening content, such as MIT has done and other universities followed suit, it doesn't take long until, well, now we've got open content, now perhaps we need to look at open scholarship, or maybe we need to look at open publication models, or you know what, maybe we need to start talking about open teaching and open learning. So if you start with openness at one level, the example I've used, and hope this makes sense to you in this context, but if you've ever tried to renovate a room or a bathroom or a house or anything, you start off with an idea that says, oh, I'd like to change the paint on the wall. So you peel off the paint and all of a sudden it's like, oh boy, that drywall is in pretty rough shape. I better take that drywall off and get some new drywall on because I'm here already. So you take the drywall off and it's like, oh, those pipes don't look so good. Maybe I need to redo the plumbing behind here. And then while I'm doing the plumbing, I might as well do a new tub and I might as well do a new ceiling. I might as well redo the floor and a new toilet and everything else. So it's this concept of if you start playing with openness a little bit, it's going to take a lot more than you expect or than you anticipate because it'll continue to produce more of itself. When you get the benefit of having content open and you see how individuals can create, remix, and produce new resources, it's a motivation to get more involved in more openness and create open teaching environments and those kinds of approaches to it. So, which of course, to emphasize again, is the precondition for innovation. Having those resources open and being able to share it with others and have hundreds, thousands of individuals contributing to and interacting with your ideas is quite motivating.